Christianity is often described as a religion of love, hope, and salvation. But under the surface, it holds a powerful and often troubling relationship with suffering. Not just as an unfortunate part of life, but as something that carries value, something to be embraced, even glorified. And this idea has quietly shaped cultures, governments, medical systems, and even personal choices, especially in parts of the world deeply influenced by Christian ethics. The story begins with one of the most central images in Christianity: a man nailed to a cross, bleeding, humiliated, and dying. The cross is not just a symbol of death, it's a symbol of willing, sacred suffering. Jesus, the central figure of Christianity, doesn't just endure pain. His suffering is portrayed as necessary, holy, and even beautiful. He dies not just for a cause, but to atone, to redeem. The more he suffers, the more valuable his sacrifice is believed to be. This sets a very specific tone. From the very beginning, pain isn't just pain. It's a path to something higher. That message, repeated in sermons, hymns, and stories, gets into the culture, and slowly suffering stops being just a problem to solve. It becomes a tool, or worse, a virtue. In Christian teachings, suffering is often framed as a test of faith. When someone gets sick or loses their job or is abused, they're told they're being refined like gold in fire, that their pain has meaning, even if they don't understand it yet. This can seem comforting, but it also creates a dangerous mindset. If pain is meaningful, then easing suffering can seem unnecessary or even wrong. In the Middle Ages, Christian monks and saints would beat themselves with whips, wear shirts made of hair to itch and irritate, or sleep on the ground as a form of spiritual discipline. They believed these acts of self-punishment would bring them closer to God. These weren't isolated or fringe practices, they were admired. The more they denied themselves, the holier they were seen to be. Today, we may look at that and think those days are gone, but the mindset remains. In hospitals run by religious groups, especially Catholic ones, terminally ill patients are often denied assisted dying, no matter how much they beg for relief, because pain, even unbearable pain, is still sometimes seen as a noble thing. It's still seen as something that purifies the soul. In a way, Christianity doesn't just tolerate suffering, it justifies it. It gives it purpose. And that can have very real, very human consequences. Think about how society treats the poor. The idea that poverty is part of God's plan or that the poor are spiritually rich has justified leaving them without help. The phrase, "Blessed are the poor," becomes an excuse not to change a broken system. And then there's the issue of guilt. In Christianity, suffering is often tied to sin. The idea that if you're suffering, maybe you did something wrong, maybe you're being punished. This isn't always said out loud, but it hovers beneath the surface. It shows up when someone gets sick and people start talking about spiritual healing instead of medical help, or when someone is depressed and is told to pray harder instead of seeing a therapist. It can create a cruel silence around real problems. There's also a kind of hierarchy in suffering. In Christian thought, suffering for others is often seen as the highest form of love. That sounds noble, but it has consequences. It teaches people, especially women, to accept pain as their role, to serve others, to put their own needs last, to sacrifice their well-being for their family, their church, their community. This isn't just personal. It shapes expectations, policies, and even laws about things like reproductive rights and healthcare. This glorification of suffering plays out in politics too. Leaders who frame war, hardship, or poverty as tests of moral character often use Christian language, even in secular governments. The message becomes, if people are suffering, it might be for a reason. Maybe they deserve it. Maybe it's building character. Maybe it's part of God's plan. That attitude trickles down. People start seeing their pain not as something to escape or fix, but something to endure, and they start judging others the same way. If someone is poor or sick or struggling, maybe they're not trying hard enough, maybe they're not praying hard enough, maybe they're meant to suffer. That's a toxic idea. And it's not an accident. It's deeply embedded in a religious story that sees suffering as a path to glory. What's also striking is how suffering is used to control. When obedience is tied to virtue and disobedience to pain, it creates a very clear system: follow the rules or suffer. This shows up in religious parenting, in religious schools, and in sermons that equate questioning with rebellion. Fear of suffering, especially eternal suffering, is used as motivation, not curiosity, not compassion. Fear. In that system, even the idea of heaven and hell reinforces suffering. Do the right thing and you'll be rewarded after death. Do the wrong thing and you'll be tortured forever. This makes suffering not just a part of life, but a tool for moral discipline. It means that any earthly suffering you go through now might be worth it, if it leads to eternal reward later. That idea has been used to justify everything from colonization to domestic violence. The promise of future bliss makes people accept present harm. Many people don't realize how much these ideas affect them, even if they've never set foot in a church. Cultural Christianity has seeped into laws, media, and language. People praise those who carry their cross or suffer in silence, as though that's admirable. Complaining becomes a flaw. Asking for help becomes weakness. This isn't human nature. It's training. It also shapes how people treat those who are suffering. Instead of addressing root causes, bad policy, inequality, injustice, people are taught to comfort with phrases like "God has a plan" or "everything happens for a reason." These aren't just lazy answers. They reflect a worldview that sees pain not just as a problem, but as a potential good. That kind of thinking doesn't lead to solutions. It leads to silence. This isn't just philosophical. Studies have shown that religious people, particularly in Christian-majority countries, are more likely to accept suffering as part of life and less likely to support policies like universal healthcare or euthanasia. There's a deep belief that suffering might be good for the soul, and that belief shapes real-world decisions. You can see the difference when you look at more secular countries. In places where religion has less influence, there's a stronger focus on well-being, mental health, and the right to die with dignity. People are less likely to say that suffering builds character and more likely to ask how it can be prevented. That's not just cultural, it's structural. It changes how societies work. There's also a strange irony in how Christianity approaches suffering. On the one hand, it tells people to embrace their pain. On the other hand, it promises escape from it. Heaven is described as a place with no tears, no pain, no death. But to get there, you have to go through pain first. The suffering becomes a kind of entrance fee. That paradox keeps people stuck. They want relief, but they're told they need pain to earn it. It's important to ask, who benefits from this idea? Who gains when people believe that their pain is holy? Often, it's those in power. If people believe their suffering is part of a divine plan, they're less likely to protest, to rebel, to demand better. That makes suffering not just a spiritual idea, but a political one. It becomes a tool of control. And when people do speak out, against abuse, against injustice, against inequality, they're often met with religious silence, or worse, religious judgment, because challenging suffering can look like challenging God. And that's not allowed. None of this means that people shouldn't try to find meaning in their pain. Humans are wired to search for patterns, to tell stories, but meaning doesn't have to come from ancient texts or divine punishment. It can come from each other, from empathy, from understanding. It can come from working to reduce suffering, not glorify it. The idea that suffering is valuable is not just outdated, it's harmful. It tells people to stay quiet, to endure, to accept what should never be accepted. And it's time to question that idea, not just privately, but publicly, in our language, our policies, and our values. There's nothing noble about needless pain. There's nothing holy about watching someone suffer and calling it growth. And there's nothing compassionate about telling people their suffering is sacred instead of working to end it. If we want a better world, we can't worship suffering. We have to face it honestly. We have to name it, challenge it, and try to prevent it. That doesn't mean life will be easy, but it means we stop pretending that pain is good for us just because a book says so. Religion doesn't own the conversation about suffering, and it certainly doesn't get the last word. It's easy to overlook how deeply this idea of redemptive suffering has been built into everyday thinking. Many people grow up hearing stories about saints who endured disease, isolation, torture, or martyrdom, and they're celebrated not for surviving, but for suffering well. Their value isn't measured by how they changed the world or improved lives, but by how much pain they accepted without question. These aren't just tales told to children. They're blueprints. They teach people how to behave when life gets hard, not by resisting, but by embracing the misery. That changes how people deal with everything from illness to abuse. If someone believes that suffering makes them closer to the divine, or that their suffering helps someone else, they may not leave a violent partner. They may not speak out about mental health struggles. They may avoid medical care, especially in religious communities where prayer is elevated over therapy or science. What starts as a personal belief becomes a barrier to healing. This dynamic can also be seen in how Christian charities and missions operate. There's often an underlying idea that helping others is not just about relieving suffering, but about witnessing it, about watching it, about being near it. Helping is tied to proximity to pain, and often the suffering of others becomes a way for the privileged to feel spiritually awakened. This can lead to what some sociologists call poverty tourism or pain voyeurism, where wealthy Christians travel to poor areas not to fix root causes of inequality, but to feel personally transformed by witnessing the misery. The story becomes less about helping others and more about how their suffering changed the observer. That mindset leaks into how society views justice too. There's a reason why punitive systems are often defended in religious language. People are told that wrongdoers must suffer to pay for their sins, not just be rehabilitated or prevented from causing harm. The criminal justice system in many Christian-influenced countries is built on pain as punishment, because pain is still seen as the best way to purify. Redemption isn't about growth, it's about suffering enough to be forgiven. It also skews ideas about forgiveness. Victims are often pressured to forgive quickly, to let go of their anger, and to move on without accountability. They're told that holding on to pain is unchristian, that true faith means turning the other cheek, even if the abuser never apologizes. This shifts responsibility from the person who caused harm to the person who was harmed. The victim is now tasked with doing the emotional labor of spiritual maturity, and if they refuse, they're seen as bitter, broken, or vengeful. That's not healing. That's control. There's also the matter of who gets to suffer. In Christian narratives, it's often the meek, the humble, the obedient who are praised for their pain, but these roles tend to fall along specific lines. Historically, women have been the ones expected to suffer silently, to serve, to sacrifice, to bear children in pain, to stay in difficult marriages for the family, to forgive infidelity or violence, all while being told that their endurance is sacred. That's not a coincidence. When suffering is glorified, it rarely applies equally. Some are told to endure, others are told to lead. Even in political rhetoric, this shows up all the time. In the United States, which has a strong Christian cultural identity, you'll hear leaders talk about the nobility of work when rejecting healthcare reform, or say pain builds character when cutting welfare programs. They frame poverty as a test, not a problem. If people are struggling, maybe it's part of God's will. Maybe helping them would interfere with divine judgment. This theology of pain becomes policy. The glorification of suffering also numbs people to the suffering of others. If you're raised to see pain as meaningful, you might be less moved by tragedy. When you hear about a child dying from preventable disease or a war-torn village collapsing, you may reflexively think, that's horrible, but follow it with, maybe this is part of a bigger plan. That second thought kills empathy. It makes the pain of others abstract. It becomes someone else's spiritual lesson, not a call to action. Contrast that with a secular moral framework. In a secular view, suffering is bad because it hurts people, not because it fits into a cosmic narrative. Relief is good because it helps someone live better, not because it earns spiritual points. Ethics are grounded in outcomes, not obedience. In this framework, suffering has no moral value. It's just a reality to be confronted and, wherever possible, reduced. That difference leads to real changes in healthcare, in education, in law. It replaces endurance with prevention, resignation with resistance. Take, for example, the global response to humanitarian crises. Secular organizations often focus on infrastructure, clean water, healthcare, education. Religious organizations sometimes focus on conversion and prayer first, then aid second. The suffering of the people becomes the stage for a spiritual message. The question becomes not just how do we help, but how can their pain serve a higher purpose? That shift delays real change. And there's another problem with glorifying suffering. It teaches people to feel guilty when they feel good. Pleasure becomes suspicious, rest looks lazy, comfort seems indulgent. If pain is noble, then ease must be corrupt. This can lead to chronic self-denial where people mistrust their own joy, where someone who has a stable life feels they haven't earned it, or that they should be doing more to help those in pain, but not by solving problems, by joining in the suffering. That's how the cycle repeats. Pain becomes a passport to goodness. And the more someone suffers, the more they believe they must be on the right path. It becomes addictive. The theology of suffering doesn't just tolerate pain, it breeds it. This thinking also plays out in disaster responses when a tragedy strikes. A hurricane, a pandemic, a school shooting. You'll hear people say, God is teaching us something, or there's a lesson in this. That idea prevents a clear-eyed look at what went wrong. Instead of asking why the systems failed or how to prevent the next tragedy, people search for moral meaning, and while they do that, the underlying problems stay untouched. The suffering continues. It's not just the religious who repeat these ideas. When the dominant culture treats suffering as virtuous, even secular people can internalize it. They feel shame for wanting less stress. They stay in abusive jobs because quitting would be selfish. They wear burnout like a badge of honor. They say things like, no pain, no gain, not just in fitness, but in life. These are echoes of religious thinking dressed in modern clothes. The glorification of suffering also makes it harder for people to recognize abuse. If you're taught to accept pain, you may not see when that pain is coming from someone who's hurting you. You might think, this is just my cross to bear. You might think you're growing from it, or that staying in a harmful situation proves your strength. That confusion keeps people trapped. And finally, there's the issue of legacy. Christianity has shaped the West in ways that still influence how we talk about ethics, family, power, and health. And at the heart of that legacy is a belief that pain purifies, that struggle reveals character, that wounds are where light enters. These ideas are repeated in books, songs, art, movies. They seem beautiful on the surface, but beneath them is a quiet, steady message that your pain is not just yours. It belongs to something bigger. And maybe you should be grateful for it. That is not just dangerous, it's dehumanizing. Suffering doesn't make people better. What makes people better is support, connection, autonomy, and compassion. Pain happens, that's life. But what we do with that pain, and what stories we tell about it, shapes everything that follows. We don't need to glorify suffering. We need to stop it. We need to treat pain not as a spiritual gift, but as a call to act, not with sermons or silence, but with solutions. The world doesn't need more martyrs. It needs more people who are willing to say, enough. That's where real meaning begins. The pushback against this idea is growing, even if quietly. More people are starting to ask why they should accept pain as a teacher rather than a warning, why the most celebrated virtues so often seem to require a dose of misery, why suffering has to be a prerequisite for dignity, and they're finding that it doesn't. The rise of secular ethics, modern psychology, and evidence-based medicine offers alternative frameworks. These frameworks don't deny that suffering exists, they just don't worship it. They treat pain as something real and serious, something that should be understood, managed, and, where possible, eliminated, not moralized. Take mental health. In religious communities shaped by Christian thought, depression is often spiritualized. It's seen as a test, a burden, even a punishment. Some are told that they must pray harder or repent or forgive. Therapy can be dismissed, medication viewed with suspicion. The result is that people delay seeking help, or they never seek it at all. In contrast, secular approaches recognize depression as a medical issue with psychological, biological, and environmental causes. They don't shame people for suffering. They ask what conditions caused this pain, what can be changed, how do we reduce harm. That's not just more humane, it's more effective. There's no virtue in untreated trauma. There's no glory in white-knuckling through life alone. But in a culture where suffering is framed as noble, people are praised for doing exactly that. The person who keeps working through grief is applauded. The single mother who takes no help is admired. The student who never complains, no matter how much they're struggling, is seen as disciplined. But none of this honors their humanity. It ignores it. You see this clearly in how illness is treated. In many Christian-influenced cultures, the sick are often expected to be stoic, to offer it up, to suffer quietly and not make others uncomfortable. People who seek assisted dying are told their desire for relief is a moral failure, rather than an honest response to unbearable pain. Some religious hospitals even prevent terminally ill patients from accessing legal medical options, not because it helps them, but because it maintains a theological line about the value of suffering. That line doesn't come from empathy, it comes from doctrine. And this reverence for pain isn't just applied to individuals, it's woven into national identities. In America, the narrative of struggle is everywhere. The idea that suffering makes a person more American, that pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is the only way to earn success, that hardship is proof of moral worth. These ideas have religious roots, even if they're no longer dressed in church language. But the cost is real. It creates a culture where asking for help is suspect, where people are blamed for their own misfortune, where systemic issues like healthcare, education, and housing get reduced to personal failings. Because if suffering is meaningful, maybe it's meant to happen. Maybe people who are struggling need to suffer a little more before they get it. That mindset erodes empathy, and it limits progress. When we glorify suffering, we stop looking for solutions. We stop demanding better. We build statues to people who endured instead of systems that prevent the pain in the first place. We confuse survival with success. There's a different way. Some modern philosophies argue that suffering is not a badge of honor but a signal, a sign that something is wrong, that a need isn't being met, that change is necessary. Instead of glorifying it, we can learn from it, not by accepting it but by listening to what it tells us. That requires honesty, and it requires rejecting the religious idea that pain must be good for you because someone once suffered for the world. There's also strength in rejecting suffering as a tool of virtue, in saying that happiness, comfort, and well-being are not signs of weakness or selfishness. They are signs of a healthy society, a society that values prevention over punishment, support over stoicism, repair over sacrifice. It's not weakness to want a life with less pain. It's not shallow. It's not indulgent. It's humane. We can admire those who've endured without turning endurance into an ideal. We can recognize that people are more than their pain, that they don't need to prove their value through hardship, that surviving suffering doesn't make someone more noble than someone who never had to. This doesn't mean pretending pain doesn't exist, or that we can erase it completely. Life is hard. Tragedy is real. But how we treat pain, how we think about it, shapes how we treat each other. Do we tell people to accept their suffering because a man once died on a cross? Or do we tell them their pain matters not because it's sacred, but because they are? That's the core question. Because when pain becomes sacred, it stops being questioned. It becomes a destination instead of a signal, a virtue instead of a warning. And in that silence, injustice thrives. Religious glorification of suffering builds beautiful stories on the backs of broken lives. It turns agony into poetry. But life isn't a parable. It's not a sermon, and people are not characters in a divine drama. They are real, their pain is real, and their healing should not be postponed in favor of an invisible reward or a moral lesson. If we want a more compassionate world, we can start by telling a different story. One where pain is not a path to holiness, but a signal that something must change. One where love doesn't demand sacrifice, but support. One where empathy doesn't wait for a reason, it acts. Because a better world doesn't come from learning to suffer better, it comes from learning how not to make others suffer at all. And that's something worth believing in.